Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs, Fan World. And here is today's content. When I look at the current tensions between Japan and China, I do not see an isolated diplomatic quarrel or a passing episode of nationalist rhetoric. I see a profound structural shift in East Asia born from the interaction of history, economic interdependence, geopolitical rivalry, and the fragility of global institutions that once kept this region stable. The headlines focus on maritime patrols, trade restrictions, or political statements, but beneath that surface lies a deeper transformation that has made relations between Tokyo and Beijing increasingly brittle. To understand this moment, we must begin with the geography of power. The East China Sea is not simply a set of disputed islands. It is one of the world's busiest economic corridors. China views this maritime space as essential to its rise, a buffer, a trade artery, and a zone of strategic depth. Japan, meanwhile, sees it as a lifeline for its energy imports and export routes. Both nations anchor their national security to the same body of water. That alone creates inevitable friction. Yet geography alone does not cause crisis. What truly sharpens the edge is the changing balance of power. China is now an economic and military giant, reshaping its naval forces, expanding air power, and asserting a larger regional role. Japan is responding with its most significant defense reorientation in decades, increasing spending, strengthening alliances, and expanding the legal scope of its self-defense forces. These moves may be framed as defensive, but in geopolitics, every defensive action is perceived as offensive by someone else. Strategic mistrust accumulates like sand in the gears of diplomacy. At the same time, both countries are undergoing domestic political transformation. China's leadership ties national legitimacy to the narrative of territorial integrity and resistance to foreign pressure. Japan's political class, meanwhile, faces rising concerns about regional security, prompting shifts in public opinion that once would have been unthinkable. Nationalism grows easily when populations feel economically insecure and when leaders use external rivalry as a source of cohesion. And all of this is layered atop deep economic interdependence, a paradox that makes the situation both safer and more dangerous. Japan and China rely on each other for trade, supply chains, capital, and technology. That interdependence has been a stabilizer for decades, but when economic ties become weaponized, they transform into pressure points. Export controls, investment screening, and industrial policies now carry geopolitical meaning. The economic foundations that once supported peace are becoming tools of rivalry. Finally, the global system that should act as a buffer, the United Nations, regional forums, international law, is increasingly paralyzed. Great power competition has weakened multilateral diplomacy. The region lacks the confidence-building architecture that stabilized Europe after World War II. In such an institutional vacuum, miscalculation becomes far more likely than deliberate aggression. In short, China tensions are not the result of a single event or a temporary misunderstanding. They are born from structural forces, shifting power, fragile interdependence, domestic politics, and institutional weakness. Understanding this context is essential before we can analyze the economic costs, the military risks, or the role of the international community in preventing conflict. When I analyze the economic dimension of Japan-China tensions, the first reality I must state plainly is this: both countries are economically indispensable to each other, yet structurally exposed in ways that make escalation extraordinarily costly. The narrative of rivalry often obscures the truth that Japan and China are tied together by some of the most complex and deeply integrated supply chains in the world. Any attempt to unwind or weaponize this interdependence risks inflicting significant damage on both sides, damage that neither economy is truly prepared to absorb. Let me begin with the most fundamental layer: trade flows. China remains Japan's largest trading partner, while Japanese firms have been embedded in China's industrial development for 4 decades. The automotive sector, electronics, high-end manufacturing, and industrial machinery depend heavily on Japanese components, precision parts, and capital goods. Conversely, Japanese corporations rely on China not only as a production hub, but also as a massive consumer market, a market that has long compensated for Japan's demographic decline and stagnant domestic demand. This mutual exposure creates a double-edged sword. In a stable geopolitical environment, it fosters efficiency, innovation, and shared growth. But in a context of mounting strategic rivalry, it becomes a source of vulnerability. Even a symbolic diplomatic dispute can trigger real economic costs, as we saw during earlier flare-ups in 2010 and 2012, when Chinese boycotts of Japanese cars and brands caused billions in losses. The current tensions, far deeper and more systemic, carry far greater risks. In my view, the greatest danger lies within the supply chain architecture. Japan's industrial economy is built on highly specialized production networks. Companies like Toyota, Sony, Panasonic, and Hitachi depend on Chinese assembly lines, rare earths, intermediate inputs, and low-cost manufacturing ecosystems. China, for its part, continues to depend on Japan for high-precision machinery, advanced materials, and technological know-how, crucial to semiconductors, robotics, and industrial automation. Any serious disruption, even temporary, would reverberate across Asia and into global markets. A decoupling scenario would not create 2 self-sufficient economies. It would create 2 weakened ones, scrambling to rebuild capabilities at immense cost. Energy illustrates another layer of vulnerability. Japan is import dependent for nearly all of its primary energy, particularly LNG. Instability in the East China Sea or deterioration in diplomatic ties could expose Japan's maritime routes and supply security. China, too, faces vulnerabilities. Its export-driven economy cannot afford disruptions in transportation corridors or in high-precision imports. Both economies remain acutely sensitive to uncertainty. Financial markets provide yet another channel of exposure. Investors react swiftly to geopolitical stress in Japan's fragile macroeconomic environment. Aging population, high public debt, decades of low growth makes it particularly vulnerable to market volatility. China faces its own financial challenges, real estate risks, local debt crises, and slowing growth. Neither economy is positioned to absorb a shock without consequences. Then there is a technological decoupling, often framed as a strategic necessity. But I must emphasize, this is not an arena in which either Japan or China can afford escalation. Japan's competitive advantage lies precisely in the sectors that China still relies on: advanced equipment, engineering, and materials. Meanwhile, China's scale manufacturing capacity and rapid innovation remain essential to the cost structures and global competitiveness of Japanese firms. Breaking these links would impose long-term structural losses on both. Consumer sentiment is another underestimated factor. Nationalist waves can disrupt normal consumption patterns overnight. Boycotts may feel symbolic, but in highly globalized markets, symbolism has measurable economic impact. For consumer-dependent sectors, reputational risk is now geopolitical risk. As tensions rise, multinational corporations are forced into contingency planning that carries its own cost: diversification, supply chain, re-engineering, relocation of facilities, and compliance with export controls. These processes are expensive, slow, and uncertain. A region that once thrived on stability is now recalculating risk in every sector. Ultimately, the most profound economic cost is strategic uncertainty. Markets operate on expectations, and when the expectation becomes confrontation, investment slows, innovation hesitates, and capital flows turn cautious. East Asia's extraordinary economic success was built on stability. Without it, the region loses its greatest competitive advantage. In sum, Japan and China stand at a crossroads. The economic ties that once ensured peace now serve as potential fault lines. The deeper the interdependence, the higher the cost of conflict. And yet both nations continue to move slowly but steadily into a posture of strategic competition that threatens the prosperity of the entire region. If we do not understand these economic risks, clearly the political choices ahead will be made in the dark. In recent years, Japan has undergone one of the most significant strategic transformations since the end of World War II. While Japan is not seeking conflict with China and indeed understands it would be economically devastating, Tokyo is nevertheless preparing for the possibility that regional tensions could escalate beyond diplomacy. These preparations reflect a broader recognition that the Indo-Pacific security order is shifting, driven by China's military modernization, U.S.-China great power rivalry, and structural uncertainties surrounding Taiwan. Japan's constitutional reinterpretation marks the first pillar of this strategic shift. The government has expanded the scope of collective self-defense, enabling Japan to assist allies, including the United States, in limited military operations. Though framed as defensive, these changes signal Tokyo's willingness to operate in a higher-risk security environment. Second, Japan has embarked on a rapid defense buildup unprecedented in modern times. Defense spending is being raised to nearly 2% of GDP, effectively doubling the military budget. This includes investments in long-range counter-strike missiles capable of reaching Chinese bases, enhanced cyber and space defense capabilities, improved missile defense systems, military infrastructure on the Nansei Islands, including Okinawa and the Southwest Archipelago. These islands lie dangerously close to Taiwan, making them a likely flashpoint if a conflict were to erupt in the Taiwan Strait. Tokyo's procurement strategy also reveals its long-term security calculus. Japan is acquiring F-35 fighter jets, Aegis-equipped destroyers, and advanced surveillance systems, while expanding joint exercises with the United States, Australia, India, and more recently, some Southeast Asian partners. This reflects Japan's desire to embed itself within a multilateral security framework capable of balancing China's regional influence. Economically, Japan is also preparing for potential friction. Tokyo is encouraging corporations to diversify supply chains away from China, particularly for semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and rare earths. Subsidies for reshoring and friendshoring production have expanded. These moves are not a decoupling strategy, but rather a risk mitigation hedge against future instability. However, it is essential to emphasize that Japan's leaders across political parties recognize that an actual conflict with China would be catastrophic. Japan's defensive posture is not a pursuit of confrontation, but a response to the growing sense that the regional balance of power is becoming unpredictable. In the Japanese worldview, deterrence is a means of preserving peace, not provoking conflict. Yet the paradox remains, even well-intentioned deterrence can accelerate an arms race and reinforce fears in Beijing, creating a spiral of mistrust. Japan's preparations, therefore, should be understood not as a desire for conflict, but as an insurance policy in an era when the old strategic certainties can no longer be relied upon. When I consider the economic consequences of a serious confrontation between Japan and China, my first reaction is to note the terrible irony. The very interdependence that made both countries extraordinarily prosperous is precisely what makes them so vulnerable. Any kinetic or extensive economic escalation would rapidly inflict asymmetric but large losses on both sides. Losses measured not just in GDP points, but in long-term industrial capability, innovation, momentum, and social welfare. Let me begin with trade and supply chains, because these are the most immediate and tangible channels of damage. China is Japan's largest trading partner. Japan supplies many of the high-precision intermediate goods that allow Chinese manufacturing to function. In an acute crisis, sanctions, tariffs, boycotts, or logistical disruptions, production lines would seize up quickly. Consider the electronics and automotive sectors. Japanese precision tools, semiconductor lithography parts, and specialized materials are embedded inside Chinese factories. Conversely, Chinese assembly lines provide scale and cost advantage for Japanese firms. A stoppage forces both sides into a costly scramble to relocate production, requalify suppliers, and rebuild logistics networks. This is a slow, expensive process, the kind of structural re-engineering that subtracts from investment and productivity for years. My conservative estimate, a sustained serious disruption could shave between 0.5% and 2% off GDP growth in both countries in the first year, with lingering negative effects for multiple years thereafter. Next, investment and capital flows. Geopolitical confrontation raises risk premia, depresses foreign direct investment, and prompts capital flight into perceived safe havens. Japanese firms with large China exposure would see valuations hit, and some would hastily repatriate operations only to find domestic capacity constrained and costly. Chinese capital would similarly avoid Japanese markets where political risk is elevated. The financial repricing would not remain bilateral. Global investors would reassess exposures across Asia, increasing borrowing costs for emerging markets and tightening financing conditions. Equity markets in Tokyo and Shanghai would be volatile, and the yen and yuan could experience destabilizing swings if confidence deteriorates. Technology and innovation represent an especially painful channel of mutual harm. Japan's high-end machinery, materials, science, and precision manufacturing underpin advanced supply chains. China's scale and market provide the revenue streams that sustain global R&D investments. A rupture would retard technology diffusion on both sides. Export controls on semiconductor equipment or on critical chemical precursors would choke innovation pipelines. We would see fragmentation of the global tech ecosystem into competing blocks, an outcome that reduces global efficiency and raises costs for consumers and firms worldwide. Energy and shipping are another vulnerability. Both economies depend critically on maritime routes for energy imports and for exports. Even limited military frictions in the East China Sea would increase insurance costs, reroute shipping lanes, and create a premium on energy security. For Japan, highly import dependent on LNG and oil, any prolonged maritime instability raises immediate macroeconomic stress, feeding inflation and weakening fiscal positions already strained by demographic pressures. For China, which depends on timely export shipments and on uninterrupted imports of raw materials, the economic shock would reduce growth and complicate domestic employment dynamics. A confrontation would also worsen tourism, education, and services sectors often overlooked in macro calculations. Japan's tourism receipts from Chinese visitors have been a meaningful source of service sector revenue. Likewise, Chinese students and professionals contribute to Japan's human capital linkages. A geopolitical rupture would halt travel exchange and people-to-people commerce, eroding soft economic ties that take decades to rebuild. The fiscal and social cost is profound. Both governments would face increased security spending at the expense of social investment. Japan, with an aging population and already large public debt, would confront impossible trade-offs between defense spending and pensions care and growth-oriented investment. China, confronting slower growth, would find fiscal space constrained for stimulus, risking political repercussions in fragile regions dependent on steady growth. Finally, the global spillovers must be underscored. East Asia anchors global manufacturing and trade. A Japan-China confrontation would reverberate through global supply chains, pushing up prices for consumer electronics, autos, and industrial goods, accelerating inflation in import-dependent economies, and producing a safe haven rush that distorts exchange rates. Emerging markets would suffer reduced demand and higher borrowing costs, and multilateral institutions could be tested by an uptick in trade disputes and refugee flows. In sum, the economic calculus is brutal and clear. Neither side benefits from escalation. The short-term political gains of signaling toughness are vastly outweighed by long-term economic losses, lost productivity, fractured innovation, ecosystems, elevated public debt, and social strain. My strongest policy advice rooted in this economic reality is that leaders on both sides should make reciprocal, credible commitments to protect commercial and technological channels, even as they manage security disputes through diplomatic and legal mechanisms. In the absence of such prudence, the structural interdependence that once underwrote East Asian prosperity will become the fault line that rends it apart. When I examine the broader consequences of the Japan-China confrontation, I cannot overstate how rapidly such a conflict would radiate outward, first across East Asia, then across the global economy, and ultimately into the realm of great power diplomacy. No bilateral crisis between major economies ever remains bilateral, but in this case, the interconnections are so dense that the spillovers would be instant and systemic. Let me begin where the shockwaves would be felt first, East and Southeast Asia. These are regions whose prosperity over the past 4 decades has depended on predictable security conditions and the smooth functioning of global trade routes. A clash between the world's second and third largest economies would immediately transform the strategic environment. South Korea, Taiwan, ASEAN members, and even India would face intense economic and security pressure to choose sides, not because they wish to, but because supply chains and security arrangements would be pulled into opposing blocs. For ASEAN in particular, whose entire economic architecture is built on balancing major powers, this would be destabilizing. Regional supply chains would splinter within weeks. Southeast Asian export hubs like Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia would face shipping delays, rerouted trade flows, and rising insurance premiums. Foreign investors, always sensitive to geopolitical risk, would hesitate to expand operations in a region now sitting between two hostile giants. The resulting slowdown would undermine the very growth model that has underpinned Asia's rise. Turning to the global economy, the implications are far-reaching. Japan and China together anchor more than 25% of global manufacturing output and an enormous share of intermediate goods production. Any disruption would ripple across industries, automobiles, semiconductors, telecommunications, renewable energy components, consumer electronics. Countries as far away as Germany, Mexico, Brazil, and the United States would feel the shock through parts shortages, higher input costs, and delayed production. Inflationary pressures, already a concern in the post-pandemic global economy, would intensify. Central banks might tighten monetary policy, risking recession in several advanced economies. We must also consider the financial spillovers. A geopolitical crisis in East Asia would trigger a flight to safety capital moving into U.S. treasuries and other dollar-denominated assets. This shift, while superficially stabilizing for the United States, would destabilize emerging markets that depend on steady capital inflows. Currencies across Asia and Latin America would depreciate, sharply raising debt servicing burdens. The IMF and World Bank would likely be forced into emergency lending operations for countries whose reserves are insufficient to weather the storm. Another significant spillover lies in the energy market. East Asia is one of the world's largest importers of LNG oil and refined fuels. Any maritime insecurity in the East China Sea or the wider Western Pacific would raise energy shipping costs dramatically. Europe, now highly dependent on LNG imports following the Russia-Ukraine conflict, would face troubling price volatility. Developing regions reliant on energy imports, South Asia, Africa, the Middle East, would also feel the pain, deepening global inequality. Then comes the sphere of diplomacy and multilateral institutions. A Japan-China escalation would put extraordinary strain on global governance systems already weakened by rivalry between the United States, China, and Russia. The UN, ASEAN, and G20 would all be pulled into crisis management roles. However, their ability to mediate would be limited unless major powers are willing to coordinate rather than compete for diplomatic advantage. I have argued for decades that global institutions must be strengthened rather than sidelined. This crisis would prove that point with brutal clarity. The U.S. strategic response would profoundly shape the global spillovers. Washington is formally allied with Japan and would face pressure, domestic and international, to firmly back Tokyo. Meanwhile, China would interpret any U.S. military show of force as containment. This dynamic risks transforming a bilateral crisis into a broader confrontation between the United States and China with devastating consequences for global stability. Finally, the humanitarian and societal spillovers deserve attention. Even without direct conflict, prolonged tensions would feed xenophobia, economic nationalism, and social anxiety across the region. Academic exchanges, scientific cooperation, and cultural ties, crucial pillars of long-term peace, would erode. A generation of young people in both countries could grow up viewing the other not as a partner in shared prosperity, but as an existential threat. Once this shift occurs, reversing it is extraordinarily difficult. In sum, the spillovers are vast, interconnected, and deeply damaging. A Japan-China crisis is not merely an Asian problem. It is a global systemic risk, one that threatens to unravel decades of carefully built interdependence. My conclusion is simple. Prevention is far more valuable than crisis management, and the world must treat this issue with the seriousness it deserves. As I reflect on the trajectory of Japan-China relations, one truth becomes unavoidable. Neither nation can secure its future through confrontation. Both are advanced civilizations with immense economic capabilities, technological strength, and the capacity to contribute to global peace. Yet their rivalry, if left unmanaged, threatens not only their own prosperity, but the stability of the entire Indo-Pacific system. What is needed now is not wishful thinking, but a deliberate, principled framework for de-escalation and cooperative security. The first principle is restoring strategic communication. Much of today's tension arises not from clear intent, but from ambiguity, misinterpretation, and the belief that the other side is acting from hostility rather than insecurity. Japan and China need a structured, high-level channel, continuous, insulated from political theatrics, and empowered to prevent incidents from escalating. This is the only way to ensure that maritime encounters, trade disputes, or political statements do not spiral into crises. Second, both countries must commit to economic compartmentalization, the capacity to disagree politically while sustaining mutually beneficial trade and investment. Decades of East Asian prosperity were built on this premise. Severing economic ties out of fear or nationalism would be self-defeating. Instead, Japan and China should identify stabilizing sectors, energy efficiency, green technology, advanced manufacturing, public health, where cooperation is clearly advantageous regardless of political rivalry. These serve as ballast in turbulent times. A third principle concerns multilateral stewardship. The United Nations, G20, and especially regional institutions like ASEAN and APEC have critical roles to play. These bodies must not be treated as symbolic forums, but as platforms for crisis prevention architecture. Confidence-building measures, maritime codes of conduct, shared disaster response frameworks, regional energy security planning can lower the temperature. Japan and China have both the responsibility and capability to strengthen these institutions rather than using them selectively. Fourth, the United States must adopt a responsible de-escalatory posture. Washington is a treaty ally of Japan and a global competitor of China. Yet this duality should not make conflict inevitable. The U.S. can and must support conflict prevention measures, encourage diplomacy, and resist framing the region as a battleground for zero-sum supremacy. An Asia locked into rigid blocks is an Asia primed for crisis. A stable Indo-Pacific requires an American approach that is strategic, patient, and oriented toward cooperative security rather than permanent rivalry. Another central principle is historical reconciliation, a delicate but indispensable component. Memories of conflict continue to shape Japanese and Chinese public opinion, often manipulated by political actors domestically. Both societies deserve a future unburdened by past grievances. Joint historical commissions, cultural exchanges, and educational initiatives are not symbolic luxuries. They are prerequisites for long-term peace. Reconciliation is slow, but without it, every dispute contains the seeds of emotional escalation. Finally, Japan and China must articulate a shared regional vision, not dominance, but co-prosperity, not militarized competition, but sustainable development. Asia's 21st century challenge is not territorial alignment. It is climate stability, demographic transformation, economic modernization, and technological transition. These are tasks too large for any one country to tackle alone. By framing their relationship around these shared goals, Japan and China can shift from confrontation to constructive engagement. In conclusion, the path forward is neither naive optimism nor fatalistic resignation. It is a structured approach rooted in diplomacy, economic pragmatism, institutional cooperation, and historical maturity. Japan and China stand at a crossroads. If they choose confrontation, the costs will reverberate across the world. If they choose a shared regional rules-based future, Asia can remain the engine of global stability and prosperity. The decision they make now will shape the destiny of generations.